Welcome everyone to our Wild and Scenic River webinar. I'm just going to go through just a couple of introductions, cover some ground rules and Zoom tips. We'll jump into our webinar presentation, and then we will have a question and answer session. So just some quick introductions. My name is Erin Matthews. I'm the Tongass Revision Plan Coordinator, so I'm on the forest. And then we have Erin Lynn Nestor. She is the Senior Planner for the Pacific Planning Service Group. This is part of Forest Service, and they're helping us support us in this very large endeavor of the Forest Plan revision. So she will also be here to help with the question and answer session. So just some meeting ground rules. This meeting will be recorded and it's going to be posted to our website. And you'll see the QR code hopefully several times if you want to grab that if you haven't already been to our website. The closed captioning will be available on the recorded version of the presentation. The microphones of participants will remain off for the duration of the meeting unless you're unmuted during the question and answer session. And questions will be addressed during the question and answer session at the end of our PowerPoint presentation. So a lot of us are familiar with Zoom, but just a quick introduction to some of those buttons. You can use that Q&A icon to submit questions to the revision team about this project or any time during the meeting. The chat will be used for relevant website links and mailing addresses. So if you experience any technical issues, you can also put those into the chat. And the raise hand can be used during the question and answer session to ask a verbal question. So, wanted to introduce our next speaker. The Forest Service is working with AECOM, and they are a subject matter expert for the Wild and Scenic River process. We have a contract with them to support this land management plan revision component, and they're working very closely with all the subject matter experts on the Tongass National Forest. This is still a Tongass decision, but they are integral into completing this work. They have the expertise and capacity to help us accomplish this work and be responsive to the public and what they need so we can work towards a better product for the public. So tonight, Ali Aminsky, the project manager and Wild and Scenic River lead from AECOM, will present an overview on the Wild and Scenic Rivers process in plan revision. So with that, I will turn it over to Ali.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, everyone. I'm Ali Aminsky. As Erin said, I'm a contractor with the Tongass, and I'm a Wild and Scenic Rivers lead and the project manager for this project. So today we're going to be talking about Wild and Scenic Rivers, and specifically the eligibility study that is going on as part of the larger forest plan revision process. For this presentation, I'll introduce exactly what a Wild and Scenic River is, what the overall process to becoming a Wild and Scenic River looks like, and then the specifics of this eligibility study specifically for the Tongass National Forest. So Wild and Scenic Rivers are congressionally designated rivers throughout the United States that are protected for their free-flowing status and unique values. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was passed in 1986, which then created the National Wild and Scenic Rivers system. A Wild and Scenic River does not need to be the entire river from start to finish or headwaters to confluence to be considered in an eligibility study. Typically, it is going to be a segment of a river as it flows, in this case, across Forest Service lands. There is also no minimum requirement for length, so long as there are unique values present along the river segment. And then in addition to the protection of the river itself, a half-mile corridor buffer extending from both banks of the river is established for protection of the riverbanks, and then again, those unique values for which a river is found eligible. So why are we conducting an eligibility study now? You'll see two references on the screen. One is to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and the other is to the 2012 Forest Service Planning Rule. Essentially, both of those state that the Forest Service must review rivers and streams for their potential eligibility for designation as a Wild and Scenic River during a land management revision process. So, as the Tongass is currently undergoing a forest plan revision process, conducting a wild and scenic rivers eligibility study is part of that. So for the basics of a wild and scenic river, I've mentioned a few times there are unique values for which these rivers can be designated for. When we're looking at eligibility, a river must have two things to be considered eligible for inclusion. The first is that it has to be free flowing, so there can't be any impoundments, diversions, dams, or otherwise that would impact the free flowing nature of the stream. And then secondly, it has to have at least one outstandingly remarkable value, or what I'll refer to as an ORV. Rivers can have multiple ORVs, but they need to have at least one to meet that eligibility criteria. The ORV must also be dependent on the river. So for example, a wildlife species may be present within or alongside the river, but they must owe their existence to the river to be considered an outstandingly remarkable value. We have a few categories that are outlined for these ORVs. They are listed on the screen. We have recreation, scenic, fish, wildlife, geologic, historic, cultural. And then we do also have this other category. Other is a category that is not intended to be a catch-all necessarily, but a category that can be unique to a forest or region. So for example, that would maybe be ecology, botany, or even research. In addition to the outstandingly remarkable values, eligible wild and scenic rivers will have what's also known as a river classification. There are three types of classification: wild, scenic, and recreational. And the classification refers to that half-mile corridor buffer that surrounds an eligible river segment. And it refers to the built environment that is within the corridor. So you can see on screen for wild rivers, that means free of impoundments, generally inaccessible except by trail, and with essentially primitive shorelines and unpolluted waters. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have recreational rivers, which are accessible by road. They may have some development along their shorelines and may have had some impoundments or diversions in the past. And then scenic rivers kind of fall within the middle of that spectrum. There is no tie between the ORVs that are found for each river and the classification style. So even though we have a scenic ORV and a scenic classification, they are separate from each other and one does not inform the other. So for example, you can have an eligible river with a scenic ORV, but that is in a wild classification. You can also have a recreational ORV, but the river has a scenic classification corridor. So that's sort of a general overview of what a wild and scenic river is and the ORVs and the classification. So we'll now get into the process behind designating these rivers as wild and scenic. So there are three phases when it comes to designation. The first is eligibility, which is the project that we are currently conducting and presenting on today. Following the eligibility phase is the suitability phase. This looks at more of the impact of designation on a river and a bit more in depth behind the protections and mechanisms of designation. And then following the suitability phase would be the congressional designation. All right, so we'll dive into the project-specific pieces that we're looking at as part of this eligibility phase. So within eligibility, there are three steps. The first is determining the inventory of waters to be studied. The second is analyzing those rivers to determine if they have any outstandingly remarkable values. And then lastly, the final step will be assigning a preliminary classification to that half-mile corridor buffer surrounding eligible segments. You can see on the right there is a flow chart that shows the start to finish of our eligibility phase. So up at the top where we begin, we first identify river segments to be included for evaluation. The first step is determining, like I said, if it's free flowing. If it's not free flowing and has some sort of impoundment or diversion, it's automatically excluded from the eligibility study. If it is free flowing, it will move on to the next step, which is determining if there are any outstandingly remarkable values within the segment. If there are not any ORVs within the segment, it is removed from consideration. If there are ORVs present, it will go ahead and move on to the next step, which is assigning that preliminary classification for the half-mile corridor buffer surrounding the segment. Once we have those pieces completed, that will end the eligibility determination phase. And then later on down the road, once the record of decision is signed with the revised forest plan, protective management of those eligible river segments would then begin to apply. All right, so we are entering our first public engagement period. So with this, we have 2 draft materials that we are looking for input on. The first is the draft inventory of waters to be studied, and the second is the draft eligibility study process document. And I'll get into the specifics of those in just a moment here. We do expect to have these materials finalized and available for public review at the end of next week. These materials will be available at the link that's listed on screen there, and also on the plan revision website. They're the same location, so that's also available in the chat. And then if you're on the mailing list as well, you'll receive notification of when we have those materials ready for review. And we are requesting feedback or input on these materials by May 3rd. All right, so taking a closer look at our draft inventory of waters to be studied, our current inventory will include all rivers that we will be evaluating as part of the eligibility study. So the list that you'll see when we have it available at the end of next week will include all the segments that we will be reviewing for those outstandingly remarkable values and potentially assigning the preliminary classification. We currently have 3,327.5 miles across 796 river segments in our current inventory. This includes rivers from previous eligibility studies that have changed circumstances, and then also rivers that have not been studied before, but are included and named in the Alaska Hydrography Database. For ease of review of these nearly 800 river segments, we have developed a web map that will allow you to zoom in and out of different areas of the forest and see which rivers have been included in our current inventory. So just like our other draft materials, it will be available at the link on the screen and in the chat, and we do expect that at the end of next week as well. Yeah. The other material that we will have available for review is the study process document. This is not our full complete eligibility study that has any determinations in it. Rather, this is essentially the recipe that we will follow to determine if and how each of these river segments in our inventory are eligible. It does include a section on our draft inventory and the specifics of how we got to the 796 segments, if you are curious about that as well. It will then also detail the data that we'll be using to determine if there are outstandingly remarkable values present, and then also the regions by which each of those values will be compared against to determine if they are truly outstandingly remarkable. So I want to dive a bit more into the regions of comparison piece, as that is one of the larger pieces in our process document that will really set up exactly how we conduct our eligibility study. So on screen, you can see we have proposed regions of comparison for each of our ORV categories. I'll use recreation for an example. So let's say on a river segment in our inventory on the Tongass, there's a Class 4 whitewater rapids section. We will be looking at all of Southeast Alaska to determine if Class 4 rapids are truly outstandingly remarkable, or if they're plentiful throughout the region and therefore not actually outstandingly remarkable. And you can see for the other resources, for scenic and geologic resources, we'll be using the Tongass National Forest as a whole to determine if a scenic or geologic resource value is outstandingly remarkable. For historic and cultural, we'll be using nationwide. That is mostly due to the fact that we'll be using the National Register of Historic Places. So if there are any registered historic places within or adjacent to a river segment within that half-mile corridor buffer that again owes its existence to the river, then that could be included as outstandingly remarkable. And then for fish and wildlife species, we'll be using terrestrial ecological units. And those are a sort of ecosystem classification type. So because the Tongass is quite diverse, it's hard to compare one area of the forest to another in terms of fish and wildlife, and really get an accurate sense for a species being outstandingly remarkable. So that's why we've proposed using the terrestrial ecological units. And in the process document, you'll be able to see specifics behind that and exactly what those are looking like. For the other category, we don't currently have any additional resource values proposed, but of course, we are open to feedback and any input that you may have on that. All right, so next steps, we are entering our first public engagement phase, and we're looking for feedback, like I said, on the draft inventory of waters and our process document. And again, we'll be requesting input and feedback by May 3rd, 2024, and we expect to have those materials ready for you to review at the end of next week. Once we have our inventory and study process finalized, then we'll go ahead and begin actually analyzing each river segment to determine if it's eligible. We expect that in spring of 2025, we will have our second public engagement period with our draft eligibility study that will outline each of the 796 river segments and the criteria by which they are either meeting or not meeting eligibility. And then following that, in the fall of 2025, we expect to have our finalized eligibility study. And that wraps up our presentation for today. I think we'll be going into question and answers next, so I'll pass it back to Erin Matthews.
Thank you, Allie. So yes, we're going to move into our question and answer session. Just to kind of point out where you can go, as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, there is the Q&A button. You can type your question directly into that box and we can answer accordingly. You can raise your hand if you wanted to submit your question that way. Whichever way works best for you. Looks like we've already got some takers. So Paul, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Erin. Do you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, my question starts with a comment because during the 1997 revision, the Tongass hired a bunch of expert scientists. One of them, terrestrial mammals, is even on the line, but a lot of the fish scientists are still around and have been participating in the recent row this rule process a little bit. And one of their comments is because of the salmon, the richness of the Tongass for salmon, like almost every stream would be globally significant because there's so few areas remaining like it that produce salmon. So my question is, like, what type of criteria will you be thinking of when you're thinking about outstanding values for salmon? I want just to throw one out. Obviously, the tribal history with the sockeye streams, there's about 200 of them, might be relevant. But yeah, if you could just speak to that.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Paul. We are definitely aware that salmon play a really big role on the Tongass and that they are present in the majority of the streams that we'll be looking at as part of our eligibility study. We don't currently have a specific criteria for salmon species of this species will meet criteria or these ones will not, but rather it will be more like a holistic approach of reviewing the, I guess, number of species and maybe population numbers that are included. So when we do have the eligibility study available, or the eligibility study process available at the end of next week, we would appreciate any input that you may have on our process for fish species and the criteria that we'll have outlined in that.
All right. Moving on to our first question in the Q&A. Who nominates a river for consideration?
Yeah, another good question. So rivers are not necessarily nominated for consideration. We're using the Alaska Hydrography Database as our foundation for the inventory. So any rivers that are named within that database are included in sort of our first round of inventory. And then from there, we look at the impoundments or diversions. So if there are any rivers within that database that are named and are not free flowing, those are excluded from consideration. And then rivers that have been previously studied in the past and do not have any changed circumstances, those are also removed from consideration. So we're really looking at rivers that have not been studied previously, and then rivers that maybe have been studied previously, but have had some sort of significant change along them that warrants sort of reviewing their eligibility again. When we do have the list of the inventory and the rivers available for review next week, we will be requesting input on rivers that maybe should be added to the list for consideration, or also rivers that should be removed based on the free flowing status or otherwise.
All right. What is a terrestrial ecological unit? Where is it defined?
Yeah, so terrestrial ecological unit is a region of comparison that's being used, I believe, in other areas of the forest as well. And so I don't have a solid definition for you today, but that is something that will be included in our study process document. Essentially what it is it looks at the ecology of a certain region within the Tongass and particular species of fish and wildlife and plants that may be included in that area of the forest versus the other. So it gives us a better idea for fish and wildlife species in particular, what might actually be outstandingly remarkable for one area of the forest versus another.
All right. I think I might be able to answer the next one, but Allie, you can correct me if I'm wrong. They asked, how will input on the draft inventory of waters be collected through the upcoming community workshops? For example, will there be a specific Wild and Scenic River station for folks to provide feedback? That is correct. There will be a station because our engagement is going to be kind of a fluid, open house where you just go to different questions that are being asked to provide your feedback for whichever subjects you want to provide feedback on. And there will be one station that does have the maps that Allie has referred to in large format. So you can see those up close, and then you will be able to provide feedback at that station. Notably, if there's waters that should be removed from the area because they're not free flowing, or if there are waters that should be added to the study. So both of those questions will be opportunities to provide feedback at our community workshops. All right, I'll go to our next question. Is wild and scenic protection different from rivers that are within wilderness areas?
Yeah, so wild and scenic rivers do not necessarily need to be within a designated wilderness or outside of a designated wilderness area. They are a separate sort of protection. It's similar, well, I shouldn't get into that, but yeah, wild and scenic rivers are congressionally designated, and the protections really lie within the classification of the corridor and then those outstandingly remarkable values that are identified for each segment. So while you can find them within wilderness areas, they don't necessarily need to be tied together.
And I'll just say, if there's something else you had to that question, if we didn't answer it quite right, please feel free to put that in the Q&A so we can continue to answer anything we didn't get to for your questions. The next question we have is, do you consider cultural value to Indigenous history?
Yeah, definitely. So we have the resource category for historic / cultural, which are two separate resource values, but for the purposes of the study, they're lumped sort of together. But yeah, absolutely. So long as the Indigenous history or Indigenous resource value can be attributed to the river segment itself, then we will be evaluating that as part of our eligibility study.
All right, as we have a pause in the questions, Ali, if you'll advance once on the slide for me. So this is just a slide encouraging the most important thing to have everyone be involved in this process. And since you're here, I think you're already maybe savvy with our website and or additional resources. But this is a screenshot from our website. There is a link to both send a message to our plan revision team, as well as a spot to sign up for that email notification list that we mentioned. That's going to be your go-to to get notified when we are having these opportunities for feedback. And then my email address is there as well. And there is a quick QR code for you. The Tongass planning page website is listed below it, but you can also get to the revision hub from that website. But I did see, Dan, did you have a question? I thought I saw your hand up. Maybe not.
Yeah, sure. I was going to ask a follow-up to Paul's question about if many rivers in Southeast Alaska have what are globally significant or nationally significant values, but they are common within the Tongass, does that not allow them to be considered as wild and scenic rivers?
I wouldn't say it necessarily precludes them from the federal designation or becoming eligible for wild and scenic river. But that is part of the reason that we have what's called the terrestrial ecological units. So there's multiple units within the Tongass that will be comparing the fish species against for fish and wildlife and for fish and wildlife. So we're not necessarily looking at the Tongass as a whole for those species, but really comparing rivers to each other to identify the most outstanding or most exemplary species of salmon.
All right, another question. Within the group of rivers not examined previously, how do you select or prioritize rivers next in line? Alphabetically, geographically, or some other criterion?
Yes, if I understand this question correctly, for the rivers that have not previously been examined, we're using what's called the Alaska National Hydrography Database. And that basically includes all rivers and segments throughout Alaska. And so we're, of course, zeroing in on the Tongass National Forest and then those rivers that are named within that inventory. So there's a certain level that I would have to dig into a little bit further within the National Hydrography Database to see what river segments they have named versus not named to really dive into the, I think, meat of this question. But in terms of prioritizing rivers next in line, we're not prioritizing any rivers over any other. We're looking at the inventory as a whole and really hoping that everything is consistent across the board for those named rivers and then any of those that may have had changed circumstances in the past.
All right, as we wait to see if we've got some other coming in, can you advance the slide for me, Alan? So I just wanted to highlight that we're only 3 in on our Wednesday webinar series, so we will continue these. Next one we have is the Sustainable Recreation and Tourism in revision. And then following that, we'll have recommended wilderness process, and then planning for species diversity in revision, and then planning for resource use in revision. And next slide. Definitely want to highlight that if you are in the Southeast area, we are having those community workshops that were mentioned in the chat. So currently we're trying for 25 different locations, all in the month of April. So hopefully the weather cooperates for our very hefty schedule. But make sure that you've checked out those opportunities, because this will be a great way to engage on all the visionary and many topics as we're getting started in this revision process. And this is also, the schedule is available on our website. Next slide. We also do have revision office hours, just if you want to come and ask Erin, Lynn, and I any questions. We'll be just sitting there and waiting for you for 2 different times, the first Tuesday of the month in the morning-ish, and then also in an evening time, the 3rd Thursday of the month. And maybe one more slide, and then I can take the next question. I can't remember what's, okay. I'll just say this, Paul, and then I'll give you the floor. Just want to highlight some things on our website. There's some confusion, I think, on where to find the past webinar recordings, and they are under the media library. So if you want to view anything that we have already covered, or will, if you can't make any of those times, those will be available in that Get Watching button on that main homepage. Obviously, all the engagement opportunities, the workshops, the revision hours, and then also the questions and answers from our webinars will be posted under the public engagement opportunities section. And then also just want to highlight our revision document library for some key frequently asked questions and some just subject information for you. But with that, I'll give you the floor, Paul, for your question.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to follow up again on criteria, and I'm sorry if you hear my golden retrievers barking in the background. Somebody's walking by, but I was thinking about criteria, and so we had fish and wildlife next to it, and it struck me that salmon abundance really drives wildlife species on the Tongass, especially bear densities and cultural uses. So the question is, when you're thinking of eligibility criteria, is there something that would weight or bring all these different elements together that would strengthen the case for something being a wild and scenic river?
Yeah, and correct me if I'm maybe not understanding your question here, but so long as the wildlife species that we are looking at from the wildlife perspective of an ORV, so long as they can establish existence to the river segment, then they could be included for being outstandingly remarkable. And it's a bit more nuanced in that there's a bit of a deeper dive there as well of really determining if a species is going to be outstandingly remarkable. But for example, bear species owing their existence to the river because of the salmon that are within that can definitely be made as the tie of becoming an outstandingly remarkable value.
Do we have any other questions or any follow-ups to other things that folks asked about? All right, let's see. We just we're looking, it looks like, for additional clarification on how the next river is selected. They were told only about the database and what wasn't used. So I don't know if you want to expand a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I'll see if I can try to answer this question. And if I don't, feel free to resubmit it, maybe written in a different way. But yeah, so there is no like next river in line necessarily for this. What we're really trying to do with this eligibility study is cover all of the named rivers that are on the Tongass. So the database that we're using will inform us of the rivers to be studying on the Tongass. And then we'll be using those past studies as well with the changed circumstances. But in terms of next rivers in line, this eligibility study will really just be blanketing the Tongass for those named rivers and reviewing all of them consistently for their eligibility. So hopefully that answers your question. Feel free to submit another one if it didn't.
Or you can unmute too if there's a more clarification that you were looking for on that question. Go ahead, Dan.
Thanks, Aaron, and forgive my ignorance here. When a recommendation is made, is the process then that the Forest Service manages it as a wild and scenic river until Congress makes a decision, or I'm referencing wilderness recommendations, but maybe you could offer a little bit of clarity on what happens after a recommendation is made.
Sure, yeah. So with the end of the eligibility phase, that's all we're looking at this point is just this first phase of whether a river is going to be eligible or not. Once we determine the eligibility and we have assigned a preliminary classification to that buffer corridor for each segment, if there's no suitability analysis done as part of the forest revision plan, then once the record of decision has been signed, the management actions included in the forest revision plan would apply to any of those segments that have been determined eligible. If a suitability analysis is done, then any of those segments that are determined to be suitable would be those that are recommended to Congress, and then those that are have management protections applied from the forest plan. Any of those segments that were determined eligible but did not meet suitability requirements would not be considered and would not have interim protections after that.
All right. To answer your question, Gretchen, on if the eligibility phase document ready at the end of next week will be emailed out to the folks on the email list. What I'll do is I will be sending out that, hey, it's live, it's ready. So that website link that Ali was showing just on our plan revision website will be your go-to to look at that information and then provide feedback to our plan revision inbox. Let me know if I got that wrong, Ali.
No, yeah, you're correct on that.
Okay. Let's see. Paul wanted to know if there would be formal consultation with Tlingit and Haida governments specific to this piece of the revision.
Yes, and this might be part of the larger forest plan revision. Erin, you might know a bit more about the formal consultation going on for that.
Yeah, we've already initiated the early stages to reach out to the tribes for consultation on the forest plan revision process. That was step number 1 for us to all the tribes there in Southeast. So yes, very important integral responsibility that the Forest Service has. So we have already done the early stages of arranging or hoping to arrange that. And let's see, trying to read a chat. So Ali, if you would go to the next slide. So I wanted to provide this opportunity. We do have a couple partners that we have partnered with to engage on this forest plan revision, because as I mentioned, it's not a small task and it's a multi-year, we're hoping 4-ish year-long process. But the public input is so important, and our partner Spruce Root did put together a feedback form for folks to fill out if you're not able to make it to those community workshops or are not local to those areas, because we definitely want to still be able to get your input. You don't necessarily need to fill this out if you're going to go to the workshop, because you'll have an opportunity to engage on a variety of subjects and hopefully different ways. But I just wanted to make sure everyone did have this opportunity. Another QR code, and that's the website link to get there. Again, and then if you wanted to provide direct feedback, questions, anything, again, our plan revision inbox is up there, and that's going to be your go-to to provide that feedback to us. And then they did just put, Erin Lynn just put the survey link in the chat as well for you. I think that's everything that we had for you this evening. So we'll continue to see if there's any additional questions or things that we need to circle back to. I'm not seeing anything come through, but again, if you did want to ask us more just low key, you can send that to all the email addresses, me, Erin Lynn, the plan revision inbox, and we'll get back to you with the answer. We'll hang out here till a quarter after if you want to stay till the crowd is thinned out. But thank you again very much for joining us for this webinar. Hope to see you at the further webinar series, and please continue to stay engaged and let us know other ways or opportunities that we can engage. We really appreciate your time to join us on this very important endeavor. So with that, I think good night, everyone.